Hey y'all, Jeff here. It's been a while since I did one of these solo episodes. So I'm really excited to get into this one today. And the reason that I've decided to do a solo episode today is because this is going to drop on the first November, or the first Monday of November 2023. So it is NaNoWriMo. It is National Novel Writing Month, which means a whole bunch of us are writing every day, and we are like crunching out words, trying to get to a certain word count at the end of the month. This is called sprint writing, where you just write as much as you can as fast as you can. I love sprint writing. Sprint writing is great. I've written several of my books sprint writing. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of like great energy to it. There's a sense of desperation that is very productive. There's a sense of urgency every time you sit down to write that really helps you move past the blank page. It's a great way to write a novel. The problem with sprint writing, I think, in my opinion, is that when we sprint write, we tend to let go of quality, and that's inevitable, right? We're the faster we write, the less we're going to worry about quality. um, but when we're letting go of quality, uh, part of what we're doing is setting up for ourselves more time on the back end of editing. Right. So when I write slow and methodically, I have less editing on the back end. When I write fast and hard, when I'm sprint writing, I have a lot more editing on the back end because I was just getting words out. And so the editing is tough. So what I want to do today in this solo episode is I want to give you 4 shortcuts to writing great scenes. And I was thinking about, when I put these 4 shortcuts together, what can people do who are writing super fast? What can they do to just empower their writing, by adapting their thinking, by thinking a little bit about what they're writing before they write? What can they do to empower their writing to save themselves editing on the back end? So some of this stuff is pretty new. I haven't shared it with a lot of people, so I'm excited to share it with you today. And I'm going to try to give you some advice that like isn't the standard, like plan out your scenes before you write. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to get into the nitty gritty of actually writing a scene and what you need to create a great scene. So these are 4 shortcuts to writing a great scene. Before we get into the writing great scenes, let me just say I'm using a PowerPoint for this. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see the slides. If you're listening on the podcast, you can't see the slides. But if you want the slides, I will be putting a PDF version of them in the newsletter this week. So if you're interested in getting a hold of the slides, go to dialoguedoctor.com, click on the learning button in the menu, and you'll see there a place to subscribe to the weekly newsletter. It's totally free, comes out once a week, usually in the middle of the week, depending on how my week's going. Usually, usually in the middle of the week, and it just gives usually tips and tricks around writing dialogue, and it'll also give you information on what's happening in the Dialogue Doctor community. So if you want to copy these slides, go subscribe to that newsletter. I'll be sending it out. The great news is when you subscribe to the newsletter, you also get a booklet that talks about like problems you're having with your writing right now and how to fix them. Like I go over monomouth, the idea that all your characters sound the same, and we talk about how to fix that. There's also a tip sheet that comes out on like the 3rd day after you subscribe to the newsletter. So you get a lot of free stuff when you subscribe to the newsletter, and you also get to follow the community and follow my work and follow get the tips and tricks that we put out every week. So but these slides will be in the newsletter. So if you want the slides, go to the newsletter. Now, let's get into the 4 tricks, the 4 shortcuts to write great scenes. Can you tell that I named this talk like 4 times? It's the 4 shortcuts to writing great scenes. Let's get into it. First, we need to do some definitions. So the first definition I want to do with you is a scene. A scene is a sequence of segments that has a cohesive emotional flow and is experienced by the reader as a single episode on the stage of the reader's imagination. Let me break that down a little bit. So, when a reader comes to your story, they open up the first page and they're about to read your book. Imagine them as the sole audience member in a theater. And the story that they're about to read, the story that you've written and designed, is going to take place on the stage of their imagination. All the lights are out, the curtain of their imagination is down. They open the first page and they start reading your words, and the curtain comes up and a scene unfolds before them. So a scene is that it's a part of the play that's going on in their imagination. I encourage you to think of a scene as a single interaction conversation between two or more characters, right? I talk in other podcast episodes and other videos about writing dialogue centric or writing screenplay ready, which means when you do your first pass, when you write, you just want to write the interactions between the characters, and then come back and fill in exposition, things like description, things like perspective from your vehicle character, which we'll talk about in a minute, things like reflections on what's happening from your narrator if you have a narrator. But we want to make the core component of every scene the interaction between characters. And a scene is a sequence of segments that have a cohesive emotional flow, meaning they start at one place emotionally and they end at a different place emotionally. And the reader thinks of them as a solid unit of your story. Scene. That's our first definition. Now, when you're sitting down to write NaNoWriMo, or sitting down to sprint write, I know I do this. I've talked to a lot of other authors that do this. You tend to write a single scene when you're sitting down to sprint write, right? Like in one of your sprints, you're likely trying to get through one scene. So if you want to think about a scene that way, think about a scene that way. By the way, this is not going to be a talk on writing dialogue centric or writing screenplay ready. Go back to other podcast episodes to find that. This talk kind of assumes that you're already doing that. So, because again, I wanted to bring you new stuff this week. So, another definition we need to go through is a segment. I talk about scenes and segments a lot in my book, The Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now. So if you want more on that, you can go there. I also talk about like setting the stage of the reader's imagination, all that kind of stuff. So if you want to read more about that, you can go to The Dialogue Doctor Will See You Now, which is the book I have out everywhere. Yeah, you can just go grab it. You can go to dialoguedoctor.com and find it on the website there too. So a segment is a portion of a scene focused around a singular topic or emotional moment. So if you think of your scene, it's divided into these segments. The segments are like when the characters are discussing a specific topic. At a topic change, you get a new segment. So or at like change an emotional moment. You can usually find segments because the start and the end of the segment is bordered by exposition. So if you've got like a paragraph of description, you're probably starting a segment. If you've got like a paragraph of reflection, you're probably ending a segment. Segments don't have to be long. They can be, they lead to at least be one exchange, which means, two characters in the scene need to talk to each other. But often segments are like 4 or 5 exchanges, I find. An utterance is one character speaking. An exchange is two or more characters speaking. So that's a segment. Again, all of this is in my book. You can go read it there. I don't want to live in these definitions today. I'm just kind of setting up some language so that we can use. Now, a lot of people confuse scene and chapter because they're like, oh, I sat down and I wrote a chapter today. Maybe, but what you probably wrote was a scene. A chapter is a division of scenes constructed in a way to manipulate the reader's experience with the story. So ideally, when we're designing our story, a chapter is about book formatting, right? How we divide the scenes, where we put the chapter breaks is about how we want the reader to move through the story. But the scene doesn't necessarily mean the chapter. If we want like to have a cliffhanger moment, we might end a chapter in the middle of a scene and then pick up the next chapter in the middle of the scene. If we want the feeling of something being unfinished, we'll do that. Or if we want to bring something to a resolution before we start the next chapter, we will end the scene and the chapter at the same time. But I just want to separate those two words because a chapter is not necessarily a scene is not necessarily a chapter. I'm going to be talking about scenes, and I just want to make that clear. So again, a scene is a moment in your story that has a clear emotional flow. The emotions start one place and they end another place, and the reader thinks of this as like a single episode on the stage of their imagination. A segment is a portion of those scenes. It's an emotional moment or a singular topic. You line the segments up to create your scene. Ideally, the emotions in your segments are moving, so the segments have different emotional feels, which is what creates that emotional flow. Right? Scene, segment, chapter is the artificial boundaries we put around the reader's experience. So when the reader opens the book, they read chapter one. Chapter one might be like 1.5 scenes, right? Because we want the reader to like have a cliffhanger at the end of the chapter so that they turn the page and keep reading. So scene, segment, chapter. Those are our overarching definitions we're going to use for the 4 shortcuts. Now, let's get into the actual helpful stuff, the 4 shortcuts. So the first shortcut, the first tip I want to give you is that you need to ensure that every scene has conflict. So every moment, every time you sit down to write a sprint, right? Every time you sit down to like, I'm going to crunch out a moment in my story, you have to ensure that that moment has conflict. If the characters are talking to each other and there isn't in your moment and there isn't any conflict, the reader's going to ask real quickly, why is this happening? What are we doing here? What's going on? And if you don't have conflict, everything else is going to become difficult. The next 3 tips we talk about are going to be really hard if you don't have conflict. So every scene has to have a conflict. Now, when I'm talking about a conflict, I don't mean a fight. I don't mean that every scene needs 2 people debating. I don't mean that every scene needs 2 people arguing. What I mean is every scene needs a blank to blank. That's how I think of conflict, a blank to blank, a question to answer, a decision to make, a debate to settle, a mystery to decode, a problem to solve, a truth to accept, a secret to uncover, a fear to confront, a bond to mend, a barrier to break, a challenge to win, a temptation to resist. So those are just a few that I like put together and threw out there, but every scene needs a blank to blank. So when you're writing your scene, ask yourself like, what is happening here? What are we doing in the scene? What are my characters? Why are they interacting with each other? Are they settling the debate? Or is there a secret they're uncovering through this conversation? Or are they like forgiving one another? Is there a bond that's being mended? Or is one of them tempting another one? So there's like a temptation that has to be resisted, right? Like what is happening in this scene? Again, you have to have conflict to give your scene purpose. If your scene doesn't have any conflict, there's not going to be any real drive to the scene. What's nice is that if you can come into a scene, if when you sit down to your sprint, if you sit down and you're like, okay, we're doing a blank to blank, we're doing a question to answer, we're doing a debate to settle, it's the dialogue's going to come out a lot faster because you're going to have in your head exactly what's happening in this story, right? Like you're going to be able to just roll through. If I have a decision to make, I have a starting place for my dialogue. They need to think about the decision, discuss the decision, ideally debate the decision a little bit, and then finally make the decision, right? Like there needs to be a decision. I'm a 3-story method editor. I love Jay Thorne and Zach Bohannon's book, The 3-Story Method. In there, they talk about how every scene needs conflict, choices, and consequences. That's the 3 parts of the story: conflict, choices, and consequences. So you set up the conflict. We're going to answer this question. And then you kind of have the characters make choices around that question, actively discussing how the question gets answered. And then finally, you show the consequences of the answer they find. This also works in like when we talk about the 5 commandments of storytelling from StoryGrid. Every scene needs an inciting incident, turning points, crisis, climax, and resolution. That inciting incident is the initiation of this conflict, right? It is the like, oh no, there's a mystery to the code. Inciting incident has dropped. And then we've got turning points and crisis as the characters discuss, as they make choices around that inciting incident. And then there's the climax and resolution as they actually like decode the mystery and then live in the decoding of the mystery. End of scene. Right. Like, so we want to build that scene around a conflict. It's going to make your sprint easier. It's going to make your writing easier if when you sit down, you know what the conflict is in your scene. If you don't know what the conflict is in your scene as you're sitting down to write, just be thinking like, okay, I got to find this thing. I got to find this conflict, because again, this is going to save you editing time on the back end. If you can figure out your conflict as you're writing or before you sit down to sprint, you're not going to have a bunch of scenes where you're like, what is happening in this scene, right? You're not going to have a bunch of like meandering, wandering conversations that don't go anywhere. Tip number one, ensure that every scene has a conflict. All right. Tip number two, know your vehicle. Know your vehicle. It's super, the vehicle character is the character your reader is on a journey with, right? So your reader is going to follow a character or characters through your story. This is most often your POV character, or the character your story centers around. So TJ Klune, I had the honor of talking to him earlier this year. Uh, Amazing conversation with TJ Klune. His book, House on the Cerulean Sea, is one we use all the time here on the podcast. Uh, House on the Cerulean Sea follows Linus. Linus is the he writes in third person close, meaning it's a third person story, but we can get inner thoughts from Linus even though it's written in third person and not first person POV. That makes Linus the vehicle character. So we follow Linus around the story. Why is it important to know your vehicle? The reader is going to be impacted by how your vehicle feels about things. The reader is living with your vehicle's perspective. So if your vehicle is excited, the reader is likely to be excited. If your vehicle is sad, the reader is likely to feel sad. The emotions your vehicle is going through do not directly correlate to, but impact your reader's experience. So it's super important that you know who your vehicle is. And it sounds silly, but it happens more than not, especially when writers are writing in third person, that they don't even realize who their vehicle is. And again, whoever's POV you're in, the character's POV you're in, that's likely your vehicle. It gets really complicated when you have a multiple vehicle story. So like Beartown by Friedrich Bachmann has lots of different vehicles. We follow Maya, the coach's daughter, who's sexually assaulted in the book. We follow Kevin, the star of the hockey team. We follow Benji, Kevin's best friend. We follow Peter, who is Maya's father and the manager of the hockey team. We follow Peter's wife, whose name is currently slipping my mind, which makes me really sad because she's a powerful and wonderful character on her own and should not be defined as Peter's wife. We follow Maya's mother, let's call her that. The lawyer who's struggling with her marriage and how to parent her children, right? Like, so we follow all of these characters. They all have their own growth arcs, they all have their own emotional journeys, and when we're reading a scene that character is leading, we feel all the feels of that character. That character's feels shapes our emotional resonance. Where it gets difficult is there's times where we're in Maya's perspective, but we're seeing Kevin. We're in Kevin's perspective and we're seeing Benji. So the question for the writer is, who's the vehicle in this scene? I got two vehicles in the scene. Whose POV am I in? Right? If you're in Kevin's POV, I don't want Benji's inner thought. Right? If you're in Benji's POV, I don't want to try to track how Kevin feels. I want to live in Benji. Right? So know what vehicle you're driving in when you're writing. It's gonna simplify things on a super easy way, because you're like, okay, I don't need Kevin's inner thought in this scene because I'm in Benji's POV. There are styles of writing that put you in everybody's POV. They're more complicated. I will say that the kind of standard ways that when I work with authors, and I see them write, it's usually there's multiple vehicles, but we always know in a scene we're in one of those vehicles POVs, or they're writing in first person POV. And if you're writing in first person POV, whoever that character is that's saying me, I said, my feelings, whoever that character is, that's your vehicle character. Right. I was just recently reading a romance about a hockey player and his girlfriend. It's called Mile High, or a hockey player and a stewardess on the plane. It's kind of a rom-com romance. Really entertaining and fun book, right? Like I'm enjoying it. It's in first person, and it's got two vehicles, the two love interests, and we shift between their perspectives. So each scene though is in a single vehicle perspective. So know your vehicle, know who you're writing. It's going to help because it helps you know whose emotional journey the reader is tracking, and it helps you track inner thoughts, it helps you track reflections, all that kind of stuff. But as you're coming to a scene, just before you start your sprint writing, say, this is the vehicle I'm driving in. I'm driving in this vehicle for this scene. It'll also help you with your conflict because you know who's conflicted in the scene, right? Like your vehicle needs to be the one experiencing the conflict. Okay. Tip number 3, keep them on their toes by changing up the intensity. So in high school, I was a pitcher in baseball, and uh, the pitcher's in a constant conversation with the catcher about what pitch to throw next. So the batter comes to the plate and the pitcher has the ball. And the goal of the pitcher, if you don't know baseball, don't play baseball, is to get the ball past the batter within a certain zone, which they call the strike zone. Uh, Ideally, the batter's going to swing and not hit the ball. So the way that you keep a batter from hitting the ball is you're constantly changing what you throw them. I was not a huge, like a lot of pitchers will have like 5 different pitches. I kind of had 3 different pitches. I had a fastball. I had a ball that was slower. We're not going to call it a changeup because it wasn't, you know, intent. I don't know. I could throw the ball slower. Um, So this is me throwing as hard as I can, me throwing half as hard as I can. And then I had a knuckle curveball, which was a ball that kind of spins real weird. It makes the batter's eye kind of look at the ball weird, and then the curveball would kind of drop off the table. That was my big killer pitch. Now, if I threw 2 fastballs in a row, I could almost guarantee a good batter was going to knock that crap out of that third fastball. If I threw 2 changeups in a row, without a doubt, a good hitter was going to knock the crap out of that third changeup. So I had to keep them on their toes by constantly changing up what I threw. Sometimes I'd throw a fastball, a changeup, and a curveball. Sometimes I'd start with a curveball and then throw a changeup and a fastball. Sometimes I'd throw a changeup and then another changeup and then a fastball, right? Like I was constantly moving around what I was throwing them to keep them on their toes. We want to do this with the segments of our scenes, right? We want to be changing up the intensity of the segments of our scenes in order to keep the readers on their toes. We don't want all the segments in a scene to feel the same level of intensity because the scene will feel flat. Like I said at the beginning, we want that clear emotional flow. And the way that we get that emotional flow going is by switching up that intensity. So if you're a big fan of the podcast, you've probably watched me draw a graph on a Jamboard with a reader where I'm like, all right, here's a horizontal line that shows the beats of your story, and then we have a vertical line. At the top is high intensity, at the bottom is low intensity, and then I talk about like how's your story moving and how's your scene moving. So we want to keep changing up the intensity to keep the readers on their toes so that the emotional journey we're taking on isn't boring. Intensity, when I say the word intensity, what I mean is intensity is the anxiety or the expectation the reader is feeling in the scene. So high anxiety for the vehicle character, high anxiety about what's happening, or a high set of expectations about what's coming next, or a low set of expectations and low anxiety about what's happening, right? Like we want to be playing with that intensity. So the intensity is kind of the anticipation or the worry the reader has about what's happening in the scene. We want to think about intensity on a segment level. So when you're thinking about your scene, if your scene has multiple segments, you kind of want to think about changing that intensity up based on the segments uh, of the scene so that there's emotional movement in our scene. Because remember, segments are a topic of conversation or a specific emotional tone of conversation. So you might start off the scene with a segment that's like high energy. The vehicle character is really excited about the mystery that they're working to uncover together. The characters in the scene are working to uncover together. But then as the mystery becomes difficult, the vehicle character gets less excited and a little more worried. And then as it looks like they may not solve the mystery in the next segment, the reader gets even more, the vehicle character gets even more worried. And so we've moved from excitement to worry. Or let's say that there's a bond to mend. That's the conflict we're working with, and we know our vehicle. And our vehicle's coming in. Let's say Billy is our vehicle, and Billy's coming to talk to Anna. So Billy comes into the scene with a high level of worry and concern because Billy needs to apologize for this thing. So we start the conversation off. Billy's kind of beating around the bush, and we're talking to the reader in between the first and second segment about how Billy's nervous to bring up the topic. But then Anna goes straight into the topic, and there's a sense of relief from Billy because the topic is out in the open. That's our second segment. And then in our third segment, Billy's going to kind of start to apologize a little bit, but let's say that Billy struggles to apologize. He's got a big ego, egotistical character. He's struggling to say he's sorry. So we're feeling the difficulty of that struggle. The expectation of the reader is going higher because we're like, come on, Billy, get it out. And the anxiety of the reader is going higher because we're like, Billy, please just get it over with. Right? Like that's what the reader's thinking. Finally, Anna challenges Billy in a segment. We feel a little bit of relief because we recognize that the expectation is coming. And the final segment, Billy says, fine, listen, I'm sorry I ate your hot dog. I should not have done that. And Anna says, thanks, that's all I wanted to hear. And there's a sense of release at the end of the scene because Billy has finally apologized. So you'll notice I'm thinking about the intensity on the segment level, thinking about how is this segment different from the last segment. When I'm processing the conflict, the choices the characters are making, I'm thinking about how am I moving this intensity through. So ideally, this is something you can do when you sit down to write. You can kind of get in your head like, okay, and you don't need the exact moves of the segment like I just did off the top of my head, but you can have a general idea like, okay, I'm going to sit down and I know the conflict I'm going to write is a decision to make. So I'm sitting down with a decision to make. I know that Billy is my vehicle. So I'm sitting down. I'm in Billy's perspective. He has a decision to make. I want him to think it's easy at first, but then I want him to realize by the end of the scene it's hard. That's really what you need when you're sprint writing, is that idea of like, okay, where's the intensity of this going? Are we going from low to high intensity? Are we going from high to low intensity? Are we going low to high and then relief at the end, back to low? Think about the intensity on the segment level. How's the intensity moving through the piece? Finally, 90% of the time, in most cases, we want to move the intensity in steps and not leaps. So if Billy comes into the scene thinking something's hysterical, we don't want to think, okay, we're going from hysterical to super sad and then back up to laughing. That's a scene that just is ripping the reader through this weird emotional journey where they're taking these big highs and lows. It's like a roller coaster that's going to make them sick. So instead of doing that, think about how you're moving them in steps and not leaps. Maybe Billy comes in thinking it's hysterical, and then it's funny, and then it's not so funny anymore. That would be an intensity in like 3 segments in steps and not leaps. right? There are scenes where a character is going to come in feeling fine, and then maybe they're terrified by something, and so all of a sudden they're horrified by what they're seeing. That there's a huge emotional jump in that scene, and that's fine. There are scenes that leap, but in general, you want to think about a shift in intensity in steps and not leaps. And if you do have one of those leaps in your scene, you got to realize you got to back off of it slowly, right? So people don't go high, low, and then high again. They tend to go high, low, and then they have to slowly build back up from the low. Or people don't go like, oh, I'm fine, I'm just walking around and everything's fine. And then all of a sudden they're in like fight or flight mode and they're in terror mode. They don't all of a sudden get calm again. That's not how it works. So we want to be thinking about the intensity of our scene, how the reader's anxiety or expectation is happening, is feeling. So let's talk about 3 ways you can manipulate intensity of a segment. So this is how you make a segment more or less intense. There's 3 things you can do. The first thing you can do in messing with the intensity of a segment is you can increase or decrease how the anxiety or the expectations of the vehicle feels. So remember, your reader is having an emotional connection with the vehicle, right? Your reader is on an emotional journey with the vehicle. So if the vehicle's anxiety is increasing, likely the reader is going to also experience an increase in anxiety. If the vehicle is sad, likely the reader is going to be sad. If the vehicle is excited, likely the reader is going to be excited. So there is, again, it's not one to one. The vehicle's excitement does not equal the reader's excitement. That's not how it works. But it is correlated. So when the vehicle gets more excited, the reader will also get more excited. So it's that correlation we can take advantage of. That we know that if we really want to move the intensity of a segment around, we just change how the vehicle is feeling. The way the vehicle feels, the reader will follow. Second tip, second way we can manipulate the intensity of a segment is we can use our cast. So if you're in the perspective of your vehicle, you see now why tip number 2, know your vehicle is so important. If you're in the perspective of your vehicle, increased opposition to what the vehicle wants to do increases the intensity of the scene. So if the other cast members in the scene are opposing what the vehicle wants, the way the vehicle wants to solve the conflict, it increases the intensity of the scene. Opposition increases intensity. Affirmation or decreased opposition decreases intensity. So if the vehicle's like, if let's say that the conflict, let's go with the decision to make. If the vehicle's like, hey, at the start of this scene, first segment, the vehicle's like, hey, we got to make this decision. Let's say Vinny is our vehicle. Vinny, the vehicle. The first segment, Vinny's like, guys, everybody come here, guys. We got to make this decision. We got to make this right now. Here's my question. We got the conflict out right away. There's a decision to make. Now, my cast of guys starts discussing the decision. If Vinny's like, I think what we should do is we should bump him off. If all the guys disagree with Vinny, if there's increased opposition to Vinny, as Vinny has to fight through the opposition every segment, the intensity of each segment increases. If Vinny's like, I think we should bump him off, and all the guys are like, yeah, bumping him off sounds great, then we decrease the opposition. We decrease the intensity of each segment, because without that opposition, Vinny feels satisfied. And when Vinny feels satisfied, the reader feels satisfied. So can you tell that I write thrillers because I'm talking about bumping people off? Anyway, so everybody's always dying in my books. I'm always killing people. In fact, when I get bored, I'm like, let's kill a character. So anyway, we increase or decrease. This isn't about me. This is about you and your writing shortcuts. So increase or decrease opposition from your cast increases and decreases the intensity of the segment. Third and final way we can increase or decrease the intensity of a segment is we gotta have a vehicle make choices. So if the choice the vehicle makes shows positive character growth, the intensity of the segment decreases. So if a character does something that demonstrates positive character growth, the reader goes, whew, good. It's a decrease in intensity. If a character does something that demonstrates negative character growth, the reader goes, no, come on. Increase in intensity. Right? So if you want to increase intensity in segments, especially at the end of a scene, your segments at the end of the scene, have the vehicle make choices that demonstrate positive or negative character growth. It's a way you can manipulate that intensity of a segment and of a scene overall. So we're manipulating. Let me give a big recap to this third tip because I realize I covered a lot here. We are a third way that a third thing we need to do to make sure we're writing great scenes is we need to make sure our segments are changing up the intensity, that we're keeping the reader on their toes by flipping this intensity around. When we intensity is the anxiety, the expectation the reader's feeling. You can think about it on the segment level. We 9 times out of 10 want to move in steps and not leaps. So 3 ways to manipulate that intensity. We know and understand that the vehicle, how the vehicle feels is how the reader is going to feel. So if the vehicle is having an emotional journey, so is the reader. We know we're moving that intensity around. We can use our cast to bring in opposition. Opposition to the vehicle increases the intensity. Affirmation of the vehicle decreases the intensity. Or we have our vehicle start making choices. Choices of positive character growth decrease intensity. Choices of negative character growth increase intensity. Right? So as you sit down to write your sprint, and you're like, all right, I got my vehicle, I got my conflict, and I kind of have in my mind where that emotional flow is going to go. You also now have some tools in each segment to create that emotional flow. Oh man, I need this scene to be more intense than it is. Add a character that's giving some opposition, right? Or have your vehicle character make a negative choice, right? That'll increase the intensity. Man, this scene is, I need this scene to be kind of a cool off scene. I need things to kind of calm down. Take some opposition away or add a character that affirms the decisions the vehicle's making. Give your vehicle a feel good moment, a feel good segment in the scene where somebody looks at him and is like, man, Vinny, you're doing a great job. I love you as a leader. He's like, yeah, I am doing a great job, right? The vehicle feels better. Vinny feels better. We've played with the intensity of the scene. So that's tip number 3. Final shortcut, final tip. Be intentional with the tempo of the scene. So be intentional with the tempo of the scene. Many of you may not know this, but as my first year of college, I was a music major. I studied music. I loved music theory. I hated to practice. I was a vocal performance major, so I would sing, and I had not really been in a lot of choirs in high school. I'm not real sure why they let me into the music school. Somebody made a mistake. So this is not true. But anyway, I would go. I would go to my voice. This is just a fun aside story. I'd go to my voice teacher. I had a lesson once a week with a voice teacher, whereas me and the my accompanist and my voice teacher, and I was supposed to have learned my music before I walked in, so that he'd be like, all right, sing this piece, and then we'd like work on that piece. But I never practiced. I'd much rather play racquetball and basketball all day and not practice like a good college student. And he would get really mad at me. He'd throw pencils at me whenever he caught me trying to read off of the music that my accompanist had, because my accompanist had memorized the stuff and had practiced, but I had not. So anyway, that's my fun music story. So we want to be intentional with the tempo or the speed of the scene. So when I use the word tempo for your writing, what I'm talking about is tempo is the balance of the energy the reader gets from the scene and the intimacy the reader has within the scene. So we're balancing the energy and the intimacy, and they are a scale. It is very hard to have a highly energetic and intimate scene. It is very hard. Like, and I mean, you can totally have a scene with no energy and no intimacy, which I guess we could talk about in a minute. But I hadn't really created a slide for that, but that's funny now I think about it. It's hard to have both at the same time. It's not real hard to have neither. But Scenes are going to be either highly energetic and excite the reader and keep the reader moving, or they're going to be high intimacy, meaning the reader is really seriously feeling what's going on and having this deep experience in the scene, right? One or the other. So the way that we adjust the tempo, uninterrupted exchanges between characters builds the energy the reader feels. So I love, as an example of this, you may have heard me use in a podcast, like Aaron Sorkin scripts. So, for example, I just watched recently The Social Network. It was directed by David Fincher and written by Aaron Sorkin. The movie starts off with Jesse Eisenberg and I'm gonna mess up her name. Rooney Moore. I'm messing up her name, but it's they're playing Zuckerberg and Zuckerberg's girlfriend April at the time, and they are having this really fast back and forth with each other. They're using short, clipped sentences. They're changing topics and even overlapping topics at times, so the segments all kind of bleed together, and they're just pop, 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 going back and forth, giving each other these one-liners, these questions, in and out, in and out. It has a lot of energy to it. It's vibrant. You can almost like feel the buzz in that scene. Uninterrupted exchanges between characters. So when you're on a page and you've got characters just going back and forth with each other, super easy in a 2-character conversation. Gets more difficult when you've got more than 3 characters on the stage because you have to identify who's talking. But when you start getting those characters going back and forth like that, the energy of the scene builds. The reader really feels like something's moving and something's happening. Part of that is just because they're turning the pages faster because of how dialogue is spaced on the page. They're finishing pages quicker, so they feel like things are moving faster. It's totally a mind game. But also it is that, like, when characters are passing that hot potato around, things get exciting. So one way you can adjust the tempo of your scene is, if you want the scene to feel more energetic, don't interrupt those exchanges with exposition. Let the characters talk, let the characters interact with each other. It builds this high level of energy. Now, exposition. Exposition is description, reflection, narrative commentary, or insights on the vehicle's perspective. So exposition, specifically from the vehicle's perspective, builds intimacy the reader feels within the scene. So what that means is that when we slow things down and take the time to describe how the vehicle sees the room, how the vehicle feels about each person in the room, the bead of sweat on the back of the vehicle's neck, the way that the vehicle's fidgeting with their hands as they're trying to make a decision, the vehicle looking up and thinking about something, the vehicle looking down, now being embarrassed, and then finally the vehicle says, "This is how I feel." The paragraphs of exposition that I just described slow the reader down and make the reader feel super engaged in the vehicle's perspective. Right now, if you're just describing a world, or if you've got like 6 paragraphs of world building, that doesn't count for this. That also feels slow, but it doesn't build intimacy because it's not getting us deeper into the reader's perspective. So the key to building intimacy is to putting us in the reader's perspective and giving us paragraphs that describe how the reader thinks or feels about what's going on, or what the reader sees, smells, tastes, and hears around them, right? Like getting us into that reader, into that vehicle's perspective, brings about intimacy. The reader starts to feel like they're really one with the vehicle. And again, we've got this scale. It's very difficult to build a lot of intimacy while you're building energy, because you can feel the two things are kind of opposed. Intimacy takes exposition. Energy means you can't have a lot of exposition. I have seen writers do both at the same time, but it's hard. You usually end up compromising a little bit, one or the other. Now, I love it when a writer really slows down in a moment, especially if it's a critical change scene where, like, it is like the inciting incident of your entire book, or it's a moment of deep reflection. like The Dark Night of the Soul, if we're using Save the Cat language, in which the writer, in which the vehicle is really pondering something deep and feeling all of the feels. Let's slow down. Let's have some paragraphs where we describe what physically is going on inside the vehicle, how the vehicle's thought processes are happening, and just let me live in that vehicle for a minute, build that intimacy. I also love scenes where like we're having a great time. We got four characters, they're all talking to each other and they're just throwing that hot potato around. Creates this great energy, a lot of vibrancy between the characters, right? Like so, but you've got these two sides of this thing, and you can pull on one lever or the other to increase the energy or increase the intimacy based on the type of writing you were doing. Now, if you imagine you're sprinting and you're coming to a scene and you're like, whew, okay, I know who my vehicle is. Billy is my vehicle. And I know that this conflict is a big one. We have, let's say, we have some feelings to process. Say we're doing a Dark Night of the Soul, and the conflict is we have some feelings to process. And it's just Billy and his mom. And Billy is going to process with his mom why he is such a jerk, right? As his mom tells him, even though Billy doesn't want to admit it, his mom is going to tell him in each segment that he is a jerk, forcing Billy to reckon with this thing, right? Feelings to process. So he's got some feelings that she's going to keep throwing at him, these feelings, forcing him to process them, right? Feels like a heavy reflective scene. As we're increasing that intensity, through bringing the opposition to his mother from his mother, we want to pause and write bigger paragraphs that let the reader feel what Billy is feeling. Give us the exposition, drops us in. So if I know I've got my conflict, I know my vehicle is Billy, I know how I'm going to up the intensity. I'm going to put his mother in the conversation, and his mother's just going to kind of one segment after another give him opposition to what he thinks is right, pushing back on him, saying, no, 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 you have to deal with these feelings. I know that as I'm writing this, I need to have a lot of exposition, right? As I'm sitting down to sprint, I need to be like, okay, this is going to be a little bit heavier because I'm going to build some intimacy with Billy. Now, it is too possible to have too much of a good thing. Too much energy, too many back and forths, the pop, 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 pop between the characters where they're just tossing things back and forth. It can overstimulate the reader, making the reader really tired. If you got pages and pages of people going back and forth, you're like, whoa, okay, can I have some perspective here? Can we slow down? Can you like put me in the scene? They're all just talking at me, right? So there is too much overstimulation of the reader. It is possible. In fact, the dialoguers this week were just reading the Eudora Whitley short story, Why I Live at the Post Office. And it is, four segments. It's four segments of conversation. You could even say it's four scenes, really. It's four scenes, four different conversations, all that revolve around sister, that are all strung together with kind of a first person POV narrator. But the scenes are just solid conversation, and several of the dialoguers were like, oh, I struggled to keep up. I was overstimulated. It was hard to tell who was talking at different times. Even though Eudora Whitley did a great job of identifying always who's talking, there's so much back and forth. It's so pop, 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 pop. The energy of the piece is so high. You just get lost and overstimulated. You're like, I need things to slow down for a minute. On the other hand, too much intimacy can weigh the reader down and make them feel like they're carrying this giant heavy weight through the thing. So I just read the book Stoner, and it's about an academic. I think it's a World War One, who decides not to go to the war and then has to kind of like live with the consequences of everybody having gone to the war and then coming back home. And man, it's got beautiful intimacy in these scenes, just these gorgeous scenes where Stoner is making a decision, and we just get these paragraphs upon paragraphs that describe how he's feeling and how he sees the room and what he's thinking about it, how things are going. But it's a tough read because as you're reading, it just starts to kind of weigh you down. It's like, whew, this is a heavy read. Like, and it's slow. And it feels like I'm carrying this anchor through this whole thing because Stoner has all these emotions. So, and the emotions are so intensely described, right? So it is possible to have too much of a good thing. You have too much energy, too many back and forths. You have too much intimacy that weighs you down. How do you know when you've hit too much? You just have to feel it out because part of the amount of energy versus the amount of intimacy is part of your author voice, right? That is part of your author voice. So you got to feel it out. It depends what genre you're writing. Some genres like more energy than intimacy. Some genres like more intimacy than energy. There's no right way. There's no right answer to this question. At the same time, sprint writing, I wouldn't worry about having too much of a good thing. That's more an editing question. We're sitting down to sprint write. The key is knowing I want this to be an intimate scene where we're really getting into the vehicle's perspective, or I want this to have high energy. Now you know before you even start sprinting what that thing needs to look like on the page. Right. You know, I got to have lots. I need this to be a high energy scene. I want lots of back and forths. Right. Or I need this to be a slow down, really feel the moment. I need lots of paragraphs. So you kind of know where you're going before you even start. Um, okay. Those are my 4 tips for um, writing, my 4 shortcuts to writing great scenes. As you're sprinting, let's review all 4 of them real quick. As you're sprinting, when you sit down to sprint, if you don't know your conflict, try to find it pretty quick when you're writing a scene. And I don't mean the overarching conflict of the story, I mean the conflict of the scene. In this scene, my vehicle is has a blank to blank, a feeling to process, a mystery to solve, a debate to settle, right? What are we doing in this scene? What's the conflict? Temptation to resist, right? Like, what's the conflict of the scene? Second thing, know your vehicle character. If you know whose perspective you're in, it's really going to help you shortcut your writing time, and you definitely shortcut your editing time on the back end because you won't have to worry about why do I have 2 different point of views in this scene. Know who your vehicle character is. It's going to help you shortcut all of that. Third thing is think about changing up the intensity. Think about your segments of your scene. Think about what you want the emotional flow to be. The scene's going to start here and end here emotionally. And then what segments do you need to do that? If you have a general understanding of the intensity level of your scene, how that emotional flow is going to happen, it's going to allow you to get more words out faster because you kind of know how the vehicle needs to feel and where it needs to go. And remember, 3 ways to manipulate that intensity: how the vehicle feels, the opposition level the vehicle's getting from the other cast members, and then positive and negative choices the vehicle makes toward character growth. Fourth thing is be intentional with the tempo of the scene by being strategic with the intimacy and energy of the scene. So if you're sitting down to sprint, you're like, this is my conflict. I'm in this vehicle's POV and I know I want it to feel this way. I know I have this level of intensity I'm going for. Is that a high energy scene? If so, you need a lot of exchanges between the characters. Or is that a high intimacy scene? If it's a high intimacy scene, you need paragraphs that are in the vehicle's perspective, paragraphs that give us insight into the vehicle's perspective. Okay. I hope this was helpful when it comes to sprinting and writing scenes. I hope it gives you some things to think about as you're writing and empowers you to write stronger as you're trying to write faster and not have to edit as much on the back end. That was my goal. Remember to get the slide deck, come to dialoguedoctor.com, click on the learning button, sign up for the newsletter. I'll send the slide deck out this week in the newsletter. All right, y'all. Thanks for hanging out with me and happy writing. Go get some words on the page. See y'all next week.